In the brutal winter of 1887, Apache tracker Talon Stormhawk was given a simple order: find the runaway bride who had stolen a fortune and disappeared into the Colorado wilderness. But when he finally cornered Catalina Vega in an abandoned silver mine during the worst blizzard in decades, she wasn't preparing to fight or flee. She was screaming in agony as she delivered twin babies who would change everything he believed about justice, honor, and the thin line between hunter and protector. The wind howled across the jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains like the spirits of 1,000 Apache warriors crying out for vengeance, carrying with it the promise of death for any soul foolish enough to challenge nature's fury in the depths of a Colorado winter. Talon Stormhawk pulled his buffalo hide coat tighter around his shoulders as he guided his paint horse through the treacherous mountain pass, his keen eyes scanning the snow-covered terrain for any sign of the woman he had been tracking for 6 relentless days. At 28 years old, he possessed the silent grace of his Apache ancestors and the deadly precision that had made him the most feared tracker in 3 territories.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
His weathered face bore the distinctive scars of ritual manhood ceremonies, and his long black hair was braided with eagle feathers earned through acts of courage that white men could never understand. The contract in his leather pouch crinkled against his ribs with each movement of his horse, its wax seal already broken, its terms burned into his memory like a brand. Judge Marcus Thornfield had summoned him to the courthouse in Durango with an offer that paid more than Talon had earned in 6 months of tracking cattle rustlers and army deserters. $500 in gold coin for the capture of one woman alive and unharmed, the judge had emphasized with particular intensity. $500 to bring back Catalina Vega, the Spanish beauty who had fled from her wedding to railroad baron Cornelius Blackwood just hours before the ceremony, taking with her a dowry chest containing gold jewelry and family heirlooms worth over $3,000. Talon paused at the edge of a frozen creek, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the bitter air as he dismounted to study the ground more carefully. Fresh horse tracks, partially filled with snow but still readable to eyes trained from childhood to read the stories written in disturbed earth and broken twigs. She had passed this way no more than 4 hours ago, her mount favoring its left front hoof, a detail that would slow her progress and make his job considerably easier. The Apache way had taught him that every creature left a trail, and every trail told the story of fear, determination, or desperation. Catalina Vega's trail spoke of all 3. He pulled the official document from his pouch and read it again, though he knew every word by heart. The description was clinical and precise. Catalina Vega, age 22, height approximately 5 feet 3 inches, dark hair, brown eyes, distinguishing mark small birthmark above right wrist. Subject fled from lawful marriage ceremony to railroad magnate Cornelius Blackwood on December 18, 1887, has stolen family dowry valued at over $3,000. Considered potentially dangerous due to desperation. Capture alive for return to legal custody. But it was the final paragraph that had drawn Talon to accept this particular contract, despite his growing unease about tracking a woman through winter wilderness. Subject may be accompanied by unknown male accomplice, possibly armed. Additional compensation of $200 available for capture of accomplice. Payment upon safe delivery to Durango Courthouse. Discretion absolutely required. Extreme political sensitivity of case demands complete confidentiality. Judge Thornfield had made it clear that powerful men with powerful enemies were involved, and that questions about motivation or circumstances would not be welcome. Talon folded the document and returned it to his pouch, his instincts prickling with warnings he couldn't quite articulate. In his 8 years of tracking fugitives across the American Southwest, he had learned to read between the lines of official contracts. This one felt different. Too much money for too simple a task. Too much emphasis on secrecy. Too many powerful names whispered in courthouse corridors when they thought he wasn't listening. But gold was gold, and winter was hard on Apache families trying to survive on the inadequate rations provided by government agents who saw his people as obstacles to progress rather than human beings deserving of dignity. The storm was moving faster than he had anticipated. Already, fat snowflakes were beginning to drift down from the leaden sky, landing on his shoulders like cold promises of the fury to come. Talon adjusted his rifle sling and checked the loads in his Colt revolver, its carved bone grip worn smooth by years of use. In weather like this, tracking became as much about survival as about finding prey. The mountains were littered with the bones of men who had underestimated winter's capacity for killing the unprepared. He had been following Catalina Vega's trail for 6 days now, through some of the most challenging terrain in Colorado territory. She was running smart and desperate, avoiding main roads and trading posts where a lone woman would be remembered and reported. Her route wound through abandoned mining camps and forgotten prospector trails, places where honest folks feared to venture and where desperate people went to disappear from civilized eyes. Talon respected her cunning, even as he closed the distance between them with methodical inevitability. As he climbed higher into the mountains, following tracks that led toward the played-out silver mining country, Talon found himself thinking about the woman he was hunting. Most of the fugitives he tracked were men outlaws and deserters who had chosen violence as a way of life. But Catalina Vega was different. The few people who had seen her described a young woman of obvious education and refinement. Someone who spoke perfect English despite her Spanish heritage. Someone who had never shown any signs of criminal behavior before her dramatic flight from the altar. What kind of desperation drove a woman to abandon everything she had known, stealing from her own family's dowry to flee into winter wilderness? What kind of man was Cornelius Blackwood that marriage to him seemed worse than death by exposure in the Colorado mountains? Talon pushed these questions aside as he had learned to do with all inconvenient thoughts. The Apache way taught that a warrior's duty was to his family and his tribe, not to the moral complexities of white society. Catalina Vega had made her choice when she took gold that didn't belong to her and disappeared into the night. His choice was simpler: track, capture, collect payment. The snow was falling harder now, transforming the familiar landscape into a white maze of identical trees and hidden crevasses. Talon pulled his hat lower and continued climbing, following bootprints that were rapidly being obscured by the storm. She was moving erratically now, probably panicked by the approaching blizzard and exhausted by days of hard travel through hostile terrain. Good panicked prey made mistakes, and mistakes made his job easier, but something about her trail patterns troubled him. Talon had learned to read human behavior in disturbed snow and broken branches, and Catalina Vega's tracks told a story that didn't quite fit the profile of a desperate thief fleeing justice. Her pace was too measured for panic, her route choices too calculated for someone driven by simple fear. She was heading somewhere specific, following some plan that made sense to her, even if it defied logic to anyone else. He found her first significant mistake about 2 miles higher up the mountain. Catalina had attempted to cross a steep ravine using a fallen log as a bridge, but the ice-covered timber had given way under her horse's weight. The animal had managed to scramble to safety on the far side, but not without injury. Talon could see blood in the snow where the horse had cut its leg on sharp rocks, and the tracks beyond showed an uneven gait that would slow travel significantly. More importantly, scattered around the accident site were personal items that had spilled from saddlebags during the fall. A silver hairbrush, a small leather journal, a woolen shawl embroidered with intricate patterns. Talon examined each item carefully, looking for clues about his quarry's state of mind and physical condition. The journal was locked, but its leather binding showed recent water damage, probably from melted snow.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The hairbrush was expensive, the kind owned by wealthy families, but it showed signs of recent heavy use, as if someone had been trying to maintain appearances despite difficult circumstances. Most telling was the shawl. It was beautifully crafted, the kind of garment a woman might wear to her wedding, but it had been torn and stained by rough travel. More significantly, it was sized for someone much larger than the slender woman described in Judge Thornfield's contract. Talon held the fabric up to his nose and caught a faint scent, not perfume or soap, but something else. Something familiar that tugged at memories he couldn't quite place. Following the injured horse's trail became easier as blood spots in the snow marked the route clearly. Catalina was heading toward the old Esperanza mine, an abandoned silver working that had been closed for 3 years after the ore played out. It was a logical choice for someone seeking shelter. The mine buildings were sturdy, there was a well for water, and the location was remote enough that casual travelers would never stumble across it. But it was also a trap, with only one good route in or out. If Talon was right about her destination, his hunt would be over by nightfall. The wind was howling now with the full fury of a mountain blizzard, driving snow horizontally across the exposed slopes and creating whiteout conditions that reduced visibility to just a few yards. Talon had grown up in high desert country, but he understood mountain weather well enough to know that this storm could easily kill anyone caught in the open. Even if he captured Catalina Vega tonight, they would both need shelter until the worst of the blizzard passed. As he approached the abandoned mine complex, Talon's warrior instincts sharpened to combat readiness. Desperate people did desperate things, and a cornered woman with nothing left to lose might still have fight left in her. He could see the main buildings now through the swirling snow, a large mill structure, several smaller cabins, and the dark mouth of the mine shaft itself carved into the mountainside. Smoke was rising from the chimney of what had probably been the mine supervisor's residence, confirming that someone had taken shelter there. But as he drew closer, tying his horse to a sturdy post where the animal would have some protection from the wind, Talon heard something that stopped him cold. Drifting from one of the smaller buildings on the howling wind came a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. It was not the quiet movement of someone trying to hide, or the scrape of metal that might indicate weapons being prepared. Instead, cutting through the storm's fury like a knife through his soul, Talon heard the unmistakable sound of a woman screaming in agony. The screams were not the controlled cries of someone in pain from injury or cold. These were the raw, primal sounds of a woman in the grip of something far more immediate and desperate. They rose and fell with rhythmic intensity, punctuated by gasping breaths and what sounded like words of prayer in Spanish. Talon had heard these sounds before, years ago when his sister had given birth to her first child in their winter camp. Catalina Vega was not preparing to fight or flee from capture. She was giving birth, alone in an abandoned mine building, while a blizzard raged around them both. For the first time in 8 years of tracking human prey, Talon Stormhawk found himself facing a situation that his professional training had not prepared him for. Nothing in Judge Thornfield's contract had mentioned that Catalina Vega was pregnant. Nothing in the clinical description of her supposed crimes had suggested she was carrying a child. The implications crashed over him like an avalanche as he stood frozen in the swirling snow, listening to sounds that spoke of life, struggling to enter a world that had already marked it for hardship. Another scream echoed from the building, longer and more desperate than before, followed by what sounded like sobbing and urgent whispers. But then, cutting through the storm like a miracle made audible, Talon heard another sound that changed everything. Faint but unmistakable, rising from the depths of human suffering came the thin, angry cry of a newborn baby taking its first breath in the bitter Colorado winter. But the crying didn't stop with one voice. As Talon stood transfixed in the howling wind, a second infant cry joined the first, creating a chorus of new life that echoed off the mine buildings like a song of hope in the darkness. Twins. Catalina Vega had given birth to twins in an abandoned mine while a blizzard threatened to bury them all in frozen silence. The woman he had been sent to capture as a thief and fugitive had just become a mother of two, and everything Talon thought he understood about this contract had suddenly become infinitely more complicated. The Apache way taught that children were sacred, gifts from the spirits that connected the living world to the realm of ancestors. It taught that protecting the innocent was the highest calling of any warrior, superseding all other obligations or loyalties. As Talon listened to those twin voices crying out for warmth, food, and safety in a world that seemed determined to destroy them before they had a chance to live, he felt something shift deep in his chest. Something that had been frozen since his first contract 8 years ago began to crack like ice under spring pressure. He approached the building carefully, his boots crunching softly in the fresh snow, but making no attempt to conceal his presence. Catalina Vega knew someone was coming. She had probably heard his horse approaching despite the storm. Better to announce himself as a human being, rather than let her imagine Apache raiders or wild animals stalking her in her most vulnerable moment. The building was one of the smaller miners' cabins, built solidly enough to withstand mountain weather but showing signs of years of abandonment. Through a gap in the boarded windows, Talon could see the flicker of firelight inside. Someone had managed to get a fire started using whatever combustible materials could be found in the abandoned structure. The warmth would mean the difference between life and death for newborn babies in weather like this, but maintaining that fire would require constant attention and a steady supply of fuel that might not exist in sufficient quantities. The crying inside had settled into the rhythmic fussing of infants seeking food and comfort, punctuated by the exhausted murmurs of their mother trying to soothe them despite her own desperate circumstances. Talon could hear Catalina's voice now, speaking in rapid Spanish that mixed endearments with what sounded like prayers for protection and strength. She was alive, conscious, and caring for her children despite having just endured childbirth alone in conditions that would have killed weaker women. Standing outside that cabin door, with the contract for her capture burning like a brand in his leather pouch, and the cries of newborn twins echoing in his ears, Talon Stormhawk faced the defining moment of his life. He could complete his mission. As agreed, capture Catalina Vega and her children, and deliver them to Judge Thornfield for whatever justice wealthy white men decided they deserved. It would be the practical choice, the profitable choice, the choice that honored his obligation to the man who had hired him. Or he could choose to see Catalina Vega not as prey to be captured, but as a mother fighting to protect her children from forces beyond her control. He could choose to believe that some things were more sacred than contracts, more important than gold, more valuable than the reputation he had built as a tracker who never failed to deliver his quarry. It would be the dangerous choice, the costly choice, the choice that would transform him from hunter to protector. As the wind howled around the abandoned mine and snow continued to fall like a curtain between the civilized world and this moment of decision, Talon made his choice. He stepped forward and knocked gently on the cabin door, his voice carrying clearly through the storm as he spoke in Spanish, the language of his mother's people who had taught him that mercy was the greatest strength any warrior could possess. "Senora, my name is Talon Stormhawk," he called through the wooden door, his voice steady despite the chaos of emotions warring in his chest. "I am Apache, and I mean you no harm. You and your children need help, and the storm will kill us all if we do not work together." The crying inside stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Talon could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. When Catalina finally responded, her voice was weak but carried the unmistakable steel of a woman who had already faced the worst life could offer and survived. "Go away," she said in accented English. though he could hear the exhaustion that made each word an effort. I have nothing left to steal, and my babies have done nothing to deserve whatever cruelty you bring. The bitterness in her voice cut through Talon like a blade, and he realized that his reputation as a tracker had preceded him. She knew exactly who he was and why he had come, but she also knew that her children's lives hung in the balance of whatever decision he made in the next few moments. Talon pressed his palm against the rough wooden door, feeling the vibration of the wind that threatened to tear the entire structure apart. Senora Vega, I was sent to find you, this is true. But I was not sent to harm babies who have committed no crime, except being born into a world that seems determined to destroy them. The storm grows worse, and even if you do not trust me, your children need warmth and food that I can provide. The silence stretched longer this time, broken only by the faint stirring of the infants and what sounded like Catalina moving carefully around the small space. How do I know you will not kill us all once I open this door? She asked, and Talon could hear both hope and despair in her question. How do I know this is not some trick to make me surrender without a fight? It was a reasonable question from a woman who had learned that powerful men used elaborate deceptions to get what they wanted. Talon reached into his coat and withdrew his Colt revolver, ejecting all 6 bullets into his palm before scattering them into the snow, where they disappeared like seeds that would never grow. Because I have just thrown away my ammunition, he called back, and because Apache warriors do not make war on mothers with newborn children. Open the door, Catalina Vega, and let me help you save your babies' lives. The sound of furniture being moved came from inside the cabin, followed by the scrape of a heavy wooden bar being lifted from its brackets. The door opened just wide enough for Talon to see Catalina's face in the firelight, and what he saw there stopped his breath in his throat. She was beautiful in the way that Spanish women often were, with dark hair that caught the light like silk and eyes that held depths of courage he had rarely seen in seasoned warriors. But it was not her beauty that struck him motionless. It was the way she looked at him with a mixture of defiance and desperate hope, holding 2 tiny bundles against her chest with the fierce protectiveness of a mother wolf defending her cubs. Blood stained her torn dress, and her face was pale with exhaustion, but her spine was straight and her chin raised in challenge to whatever fate had sent to test her. You are the tracker they call Ghost Walker, she said, studying his face with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. The Apache who can find anyone, anywhere, and who has never failed to bring back his prey. Talon felt something twist in his chest at being called prey by this remarkable woman who had just given birth alone in an abandoned mine while a blizzard raged around her. I am, he replied simply, but today I choose not to be that man. He stepped into the cabin and closed the door against the howling wind, his eyes adjusting to the dim firelight that revealed the magnitude of what Catalina had accomplished. She had transformed the abandoned space into a functional shelter using nothing but determination and intelligence. Old mining equipment had been arranged to block drafts, moth-eaten blankets had been layered to create insulation, and a fire burned steadily in what had once been a cooking stove. Most impressively, she had created a nest of clean cloth and soft materials where the twins could be kept warm and safe. The babies were perfect, tiny miracles with wrinkled faces and impossibly small fingers that gripped weakly at the air. One was slightly larger than the other, but both appeared healthy despite their dramatic entrance into the world. Talon found himself staring at them with an expression of wonder he had not felt since childhood, when the birth of new colts in spring had seemed like the most magical thing in creation. These were not just babies, they were hope made flesh. Proof that life could triumph over the worst circumstances. They came early, Catalina said, following his gaze to her children. I was not supposed to give birth for another month, but the stress of running, the cold, the fear my body could not wait any longer. She adjusted her grip on the twins, wincing slightly from pain that was still fresh. The boy was born first, fighting and angry at the world from his first breath. The girl came quietly, as if she understood that silence might keep them all alive. Talon knelt beside the makeshift bed and reached into his pack, withdrawing supplies that could mean the difference between survival and death. Dried meat, hardtack biscuits, a small bag of cornmeal, and most importantly, a leather waterskin that was still partially liquid despite the freezing temperature. "Eat," he said, placing the food within her reach. "You need strength to feed them, and they need you healthy if they are going to survive." But Catalina made no move toward the food, her eyes never leaving Talon's face as she tried to understand this strange reversal of fortune. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why help the woman you were sent to capture? Why throw away your bullets and feed your prey instead of dragging her back to face whatever justice wealthy men have decided she deserves?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire, and Talon found himself struggling to articulate thoughts and feelings that had no clear shape in his mind. "Because," he said finally, 8 years ago I made a choice to become someone who takes life for money rather than someone who protects it for honor. Today, looking at you and your children, I remember who I was before I became the Ghost Walker. I remember that Apache warriors are supposed to defend the innocent, not deliver them to their enemies." He gestured toward the twins, whose soft breathing was the only sound in the cabin besides the wind outside. "They have done nothing wrong, and neither have you." Catalina's eyes flashed with sudden anger. "You know nothing about what I have or have not done. You know only what Judge Thornfield and Cornelius Blackwood told you, and those men would not recognize truth if it rose from the ground and bit them like a rattlesnake." Her voice grew stronger as righteous fury gave her energy that exhaustion had stolen. "Did they tell you why I ran from my wedding? Did they explain what kind of man Blackwood really is? Did they mention that I was not the first young woman to disappear after crossing him?" The vehemence in her words made Talon sit back on his heels, sensing that he was about to learn something that would change his understanding of this entire situation. "Tell me," he said simply, and those two words opened a floodgate of pain and truth that had been building pressure behind Catalina's composed facade for weeks. "Cornelius Blackwood owns half the railroad construction contracts in Colorado Territory," she began, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon the demons she described. "He also owns judges, sheriffs, federal marshals, and politicians who do his bidding without question. What he wanted from me was not just a wife. He wanted a way to legitimize his theft of Mexican land grants and his exploitation of immigrant workers who died building his railroads." She shifted the twins to a more comfortable position before continuing. "My family has lived in this territory for 6 generations, long before it became Colorado, long before Americans decided that our land grants from the Spanish crown were worthless paper. Blackwood discovered that marrying into the Vega family would give him legal claim to over 50,000 acres of prime ranch and mining land that he could never acquire through honest purchase." Talon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Land fraud was a common crime in territories where American law clashed with older Spanish and Mexican legal traditions, but it usually involved forged documents and bribed officials, not forced marriages to unwilling brides. "Your family agreed to this arrangement?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "My father died 2 years ago in what Blackwood's men called a riding accident," Catalina replied, her voice hardening with old grief and newer anger. "My brother Miguel tried to fight Blackwood's claim to our land through the territorial courts, but lawyers cost money we did not have, and judges ruled against us in cases that should have been simple to win. When Miguel continued to resist, he disappeared one night while riding home from town. The pattern was becoming clear to Talon, and it painted a picture of systematic violence designed to eliminate obstacles to Blackwood's ambitions. "They killed your brother," he said, and it was not a question. Catalina nodded, tears she had been holding back finally beginning to fall. They threw his body in the Rio Grande and told everyone he must have been drinking and fallen from his horse. But Miguel never drank, and he could ride better than any vaquero in the territory. They murdered him because he would not let them steal our land. And then they came for you. Talon continued, understanding dawning like sunrise over a battlefield. The last member of the Vega family, the final obstacle to their complete control of your property. Catalina wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, careful not to disturb the sleeping babies. Judge Thornfield appeared at my door with documents declaring that as my family's legal guardian, he had arranged a marriage that would protect my interests and ensure my security. The wedding was scheduled for 3 days later. Whether I agreed or not, the enormity of the conspiracy began to crystallize in Talon's mind. This was not about a runaway bride or stolen dowry gold. It was about a massive land grab that required eliminating the rightful owners through murder, legal manipulation, and forced marriage. Catalina Vega was not a criminal fleeing justice. She was a victim who had escaped from what amounted to legalized kidnapping and theft on a scale that defied imagination. The night before the wedding, Catalina continued, her voice growing stronger as she finally shared the burden she had been carrying alone. I overheard Blackwood talking to Judge Thornfield about their plans for after the ceremony. They intended to have me declared mentally incompetent within 6 months, probably after arranging for me to have an accident that would leave me unable to challenge their control of the land. I was to be a temporary legal fiction, not a wife. Talon stood and began pacing the small cabin, his warrior's mind processing the tactical implications of what he had learned. If Catalina was telling the truth, and every instinct told him she was, then Judge Thornfield's contract was not a legitimate law enforcement action, but a murder-for-hire arrangement, designed to eliminate the final witness to a massive criminal conspiracy. By accepting the contract, Talon had unknowingly become part of a plot that violated every principle of justice he had ever believed in. The gold, he said, remembering the official justification for her pursuit. The dowry they claim you stole. Catalina laughed bitterly. My mother's jewelry, passed down through 6 generations of Vega women. Blackwood claimed it as part of the marriage settlement, but it was never his to take. When I fled, I took only what belonged to my family by right: our land grants, our jewelry, and the evidence my brother had gathered about Blackwood's crimes before they killed him. This last revelation hit Talon like a physical blow. Evidence? What kind of evidence? Catalina reached beneath the makeshift bedding and withdrew a leather portfolio that had clearly been hidden with great care. Miguel was not just fighting for our land, he was documenting a pattern of fraud and murder that stretched across the entire Torre. Blackwood and his associates have been systematically eliminating Mexican families and stealing their property for over 5 years. She opened the portfolio to reveal documents, photographs, and what appeared to be sworn statements from witnesses. Names, dates, methods, everything needed to prove that territorial officials have been complicit in the largest land theft in Colorado history. Miguel gathered testimony from families who had lost everything, evidence of forged documents, proof of bribes paid to judges and marshals. He died before he could present it to federal authorities, but he made sure I knew where he had hidden copies. Talon studied the documents by firelight, his blood growing colder with each page he turned. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering: dozens of Mexican families murdered or driven from their land, millions of acres stolen through forged deeds and corrupt court rulings, federal officials bought and paid for by railroad interests that saw human lives as obstacles to progress. If these documents were authentic, they represented evidence of crimes that reached from local courthouses to the territorial government itself. Why did you not take this evidence to federal authorities before your wedding? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Because the federal marshal for this territory is Samuel Wickham, and Wickham has been taking Blackwood's money for 3 years, Catalina replied. Miguel tried to approach him once, and 2 days later, our barn burned down with a dozen horses trapped inside. The message was clear: keep quiet or face worse consequences. The twins began to stir, making small mewing sounds that tugged at something deep in Talon's chest. Catalina immediately focused her attention on them, checking their breathing and adjusting their blankets with movements that spoke of natural maternal instinct despite her inexperience. Watching her care for her children while discussing the men who wanted to kill them all created a strange cognitive dissonance in Talon's mind. "There is something else," Catalina said quietly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something Miguel discovered just before he died, something so dangerous that he made me swear never to tell anyone unless there was no other choice." She looked directly at Talon, her eyes searching his face for some sign that she could trust. Him with information that could get them all killed. "Tell me," he said simply. "Blackwood is not just stealing land for railroad construction," she continued. "He has discovered silver deposits on Mexican properties that could be worth millions of dollars. The railroad contracts are just a cover story. The real money is in mining rights that he can only claim legally if he owns the land free and clear of previous grants. Every family he has destroyed, every person he has killed, has been eliminated to clear title to potential silver mines." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Talon's mind, and the full magnitude of the conspiracy became clear. This was not just about railroad construction or even large-scale land theft. It was about one of the richest mineral discoveries in Colorado history, and the systematic murder of anyone who stood between Blackwood and complete control of that wealth. The stakes were high enough to justify any level of violence, any degree of corruption, any amount of collateral damage outside the cabin. The blizzard continued to rage with undiminished fury, but inside, warmed by fire and the shared understanding of people who had chosen to trust each other despite impossible circumstances, Talon and Catalina began to plan not just their survival, but their resistance to forces that had already marked them all for death. The hunter had become a protector, and the protector was about to become something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The first light of dawn broke pale and uncertain through the storm clouds, casting an eerie glow across the snow-covered mining camp as Talon emerged from the cabin to assess their situation. The blizzard had finally begun to weaken, though snow still fell in thick, lazy flakes that promised at least another day of dangerous travel conditions. During the long night, he had listened to Catalina's whispered stories about her brothers' investigation while keeping the fire fed and helping care for the twins, who seemed determined to make their presence known to the world despite the hostile circumstances of their birth. Inside the cabin, Catalina sat propped against a pile of salvaged blankets, nursing one baby while the other slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle Talon had constructed from a wooden crate and strips of cloth torn from his spare shirt. She looked stronger this morning, though still pale from blood loss and exhaustion. The fierce determination that had carried her through childbirth alone in a blizzard now focused on the practical challenges of keeping her children alive long enough to see justice done. "We cannot stay here much longer," Talon said as he returned to the warmth of the cabin, stamping snow from his boots. "This place is too exposed, and when the storm clears completely, Blackwood's men will resume their search. They know this country as well as I do, and they will check every abandoned mine and prospector camp between here and the Mexican border." He knelt beside the fire and added another piece of broken furniture to the flames, rationing their limited fuel supply. Catalina looked up from the baby at her breast, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight and something harder that might have been steel wrapped in velvet. "Where can we go that will be safe for newborn children? Every town has sheriffs who take Blackwood's money. Every settlement has telegraph lines that can summon federal marshals who work for corrupt judges. We are 3 people with 2 infants, trying to fight an empire built on murder and lies. There is a place," Talon said slowly, an idea forming in his mind that was either brilliant or suicidal. 2 days' ride south of here, if we can manage. The distance, there's a settlement called Refugio Valley. It was founded by Mexican families who refused to give up their land grants when Colorado became a territory. They have their own law, their own justice, and they have successfully resisted every attempt by territorial officials to assert authority over them. The concept was intriguing, but fraught with dangers that Catalina immediately recognized. 2 days' ride through winter mountain country with newborn babies? Even if the weather cooperates, even if we avoid Blackwood search parties, how do we know this Refugio Valley will welcome strangers fleeing from territorial law? How do we know they will not simply turn us over to the highest bidder? Talon reached into his pack and withdrew a small leather pouch, opening it to reveal a collection of items that looked like random trinkets, but held deeper significance for those who understood Apache traditions. A bear claw carved with sacred symbols, an eagle feather marked with distinctive paint patterns, and a silver pendant that bore the intertwined serpent design of the Chiricahua Apache. Because 5 years ago, I helped the people of Refugio Valley fight off a raid by federal cavalry units who were trying to force them off their land. They know me, and they know that Apache warriors keep their word when it comes to protecting the innocent. The explanation satisfied some of Catalina's concerns, but practical problems remained that could not be solved with good intentions and mutual respect. The babies are too young for such a journey, she said, looking down at the tiny faces that seemed impossibly fragile in the harsh light of mountain dawn. They need warmth, regular feeding, protection from wind and cold that could kill them in minutes. Even if we had a proper wagon and warm clothing, the risk would be enormous. Then we make the risk smaller, Talon replied, his mind already working through logistical challenges that would have defeated most men, but represented familiar problems for someone trained in Apache survival techniques. We travel at night when the air is colder, but the visibility is better for avoiding search parties. We cache supplies along the route, so we never have to carry more than we can manage in emergency situations. We create warm shelters that can be assembled quickly when the babies need feeding or rest. He moved to the window and studied the terrain visible through gaps in the boarded shutters, calculating distances and identifying potential shelter locations with the methodical precision of a tracker who had learned that survival depended on planning for every contingency. Most importantly, we do not travel alone. There are people in these mountains who have their own reasons for avoiding territorial law, people who might be willing to help if they understand what we are fighting against. Catalina adjusted the baby's position and looked skeptical. What kind of people? Outlaws and desperados who would sell us to Blackwood for the bounty money. Drifters and prospectors who care nothing for justice or the fate of Mexican families. Why would such men risk their own safety to help strangers fleeing from powerful enemies? Her questions were logical, born from bitter experience with betrayal and disappointment. Because, Talon said, turning back from the window with something approaching a smile on his weathered face, some of those outlaws and desperados are Mexican families who lost everything to Blackwood's land grabs. Some of those drifters and prospectors are former territorial officials who refused to take bribes and were driven from their positions. There is a whole community of people in these mountains who have been waiting for someone brave enough to fight back. The idea was audacious, potentially transforming their desperate flight into something resembling an organized resistance movement. But it also meant trusting their lives and the lives of the twins to people they had never met. People whose motivations and loyalties were unknown quantities in an already dangerous equation. Catalina studied Talon's face, looking for signs of the reckless optimism that got people killed in situations like theirs. What she saw instead was the calculating intelligence of a warrior who understood both the risks and the potential rewards of bold action. You have already contacted some of these people, she said, reading between the lines of his confident proposal. During your years as a tracker, you built relationships with people who live outside territorial law. You know who can be trusted and who cannot. Talon nodded, acknowledging her insight. A tracker learns quickly that survival depends on information. Networks that extend far beyond official channels. I know which prospectors have found silver on disputed land and which ones have been cheated by corrupt assayers. I know which Mexican families have been driven from their homes and which ones are hiding in remote valleys, waiting for a chance to reclaim what was stolen from them. He moved to his pack and began withdrawing items that looked like random camping supplies but were actually components of a sophisticated communication system used by people who could not rely on telegraphs or postal services. Strips of colored cloth that could be arranged in coded patterns, small mirrors for signaling across long distances, and distinctive arrow points that served as recognition tokens among trusted allies. There's a man named Eduardo Morales, who operates a trading post in the high country between here and Refugio Valley. Talon continued, arranging the signaling materials on a flat surface near the fire. His family lost 2,000 acres to forged documents 3 years ago, and his eldest son was murdered by federal marshals who claimed he was resisting arrest. Eduardo has been gathering information about Blackwood's operations ever since, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. The scope of the resistance network was beginning to become clear to Catalina, and with it came the first real hope she had felt since fleeing from her wedding. If Talon was right, if there really were organized groups of people fighting against the corruption that had destroyed so many lives, then perhaps her brother's evidence could serve as the catalyst for something larger than simple revenge or personal survival. What you are describing, she said slowly, is not just an escape plan. It is a revolution. The word hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire, carrying implications that neither of them had fully considered until this moment. They were not just trying to save their own lives, they were potentially igniting a conflict that could reshape the political landscape of the entire territory. Talon met her gaze directly, and for the first time since entering the cabin, Catalina saw something in his eyes that might have been the ghost of the idealistic young warrior he had been before. 8 years of compromise and moral flexibility had taught him to see people as prey rather than fellow human beings deserving of protection. Sometimes, he said quietly, revolution is the only response to systematic injustice. Sometimes the choice is between fighting back and watching evil triumph through the cowardice of good people. Outside the cabin, the sound of horses approaching through the snow caused both of them to freeze in sudden alertness. Talon moved silently to the window, peering through gaps in the boards while his hand instinctively reached for the rifle he had propped against the wall. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 riders in heavy coats, moving with the purposeful determination of men who knew exactly where they were going and what they expected to find when they arrived. Blackwood's men, he whispered, recognizing the lead rider as Jake Morrison, a former Army scout who had turned to private enforcement work when drinking and gambling debts made regular employment impossible. Morrison was known for his tracking skills and his complete lack of conscience when it came to completing contracts, regardless of collateral damage or moral considerations. If he had found their trail, it meant the hunt was about to become considerably more dangerous. Catalina immediately began gathering the twins, wrapping them in layers of cloth and blankets while moving with the careful efficiency of a mother who understood that her children's lives depended on speed and silence. How did they find us so quickly? She whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. The storm should have covered our tracks, and this place is miles from any main trail. Talon studied the approaching riders, noting details that told him more about their intentions than he wanted to know. They were armed with rifles and revolvers. They moved with military precision that suggested professional training. And most ominously, they carried ropes and chains that indicated they had no intention of bringing back prisoners who could testify about what they had witnessed in these mountains. They are not here to capture us. he said grimly, reaching for his pack and beginning to stuff essential supplies into a smaller emergency bundle that could be carried quickly over rough terrain. Morrison has orders to eliminate witnesses, which means Blackwood has decided that keeping us alive is more dangerous than the risk of killing us without recovering the evidence we carry. The realization struck both of them simultaneously. If Blackwood was willing to authorize murder rather than capture, it meant he knew about Miguel's documentation and understood the threat it represented to his entire criminal enterprise. Somehow, word of Catalina's escape with her brother's evidence had reached the railroad magnate, and he had decided that permanent silence was preferable to the risk of exposure through legal proceedings. "There is a back way out of this cabin," Talon said, moving to what appeared to be a solid wall, but was actually a section of boards that could be removed to provide emergency access to the mine tunnels beyond. The original miners built these escape routes in case of cave-ins or hostile raids. If we move quickly and quietly, we can reach the main shaft without being seen from outside. But escaping the immediate threat was only the first challenge they faced. Traveling through abandoned mine tunnels with newborn babies in winter weather represented a different but equally deadly set of risks. The tunnels were dark, cold, and potentially unstable after years of neglect. They offered concealment from pursuing gunmen, but they could also become death traps if structural supports had weakened, or if flooding had made passages impassable. Catalina finished securing the twins in a carrying sling that would keep them close to her body heat while leaving her hands free for climbing and balance. "How far do these tunnels extend?" she asked, checking the contents of the leather portfolio to ensure that Miguel's evidence remained secure. "Can they take us beyond the range of men on horseback, or will we simply be trapped underground when they realize we have escaped?" "The main shaft connects to 3 other mines in this district," Talon replied, removing the loose boards to reveal a narrow opening that led into absolute darkness. "If the tunnels are still passable, we can emerge at the old Esperanza workings 2 miles north of here, or at the abandoned Tres Hermanos claim 4 miles to the east. Either location would give us options for continued travel that Morrison cannot predict or easily follow." The sound of voices outside indicated that the riders had reached the cabin and were preparing to dismount. Talon could hear Morrison's distinctive drawl giving orders to his companions, men whose names he recognized as hired killers who worked for anyone willing to pay their rates. In minutes, they would kick in the door, expecting to find a helpless woman with newborn babies, unprepared for resistance or escape. "We go now," Talon whispered, helping Catalina climb through the narrow opening into the mine tunnel beyond. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint flicker of light from the cabin fire behind them. The air was cold and stale, carrying the musty smell of abandoned workings and the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the depths of the mountain. Behind them, the cabin door exploded inward as Morrison's boot connected with the wooden barrier. Angry voices filled the small space as the gunmen discovered their quarry had vanished, leaving behind only a dying fire and the lingering scent of newborn babies. Within moments, they would find the loose boards and realize that their targets had escaped into the mine system. But by then Talon and Catalina would be deep in the tunnels, navigating by touch and instinct through passages that led toward either safety or a different kind of death. As they moved deeper into the mountain, following rails that had once carried cars full of silver ore toward distant smelters, the twins remained remarkably quiet, as if they understood instinctively that silence meant survival in this underground world of shadows and echoes. Behind them, growing fainter with each step, came the sounds of frustrated men who had expected an easy capture and instead found themselves facing a pursuit through treacherous terrain that favored the hunted over the hunters. The abandoned mine tunnels stretched into darkness like the throat of some ancient beast, swallowing their footsteps and muffling the distant shouts of Morrison's men as they discovered the escape route and began their own descent into the underground labyrinth. Talon moved by touch and memory, his Apache training allowing him to navigate by the subtle changes in air current and sound that indicated branching passages or potential obstacles ahead. Behind him, Catalina followed with remarkable composure, one hand trailing along the wooden support beams, while the other cradled the twins against her chest in their makeshift sling. The mine rails beneath their feet provided a reliable guide through the main tunnel, but Talon knew that following the obvious path would make them easy prey for men with lanterns and superior numbers. After 20 minutes of steady progress deeper into the mountain, he stopped at a junction where the main shaft branched into 3 separate passages, each leading toward different sections of the mining complex. The choices they made here would determine whether they emerged into daylight as free people or walked deeper into a trap from which there would be no escape. Which way? Catalina whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive silence of the underground world. The twins had remained remarkably quiet during their journey, as if they understood instinctively that their survival depended on remaining undetected by the men who hunted them. Talon could hear the distant echo of boots on stone somewhere behind them, evidence that Morrison had indeed followed them into the tunnels with the dogged persistence of a professional killer. Talon knelt and pressed his ear to each of the 3 rail lines, listening for vibrations that might indicate structural stability or dangerous conditions ahead. The leftmost passage carried the sound of running water, probably from an underground stream that could provide fresh drinking water, but also indicated potential flooding. The center tunnel felt solid and well-maintained, but it led directly toward the Esperanza mine where Morrison's men would expect them to emerge. The rightmost passage felt different cooler air currents and a subtle upward slope that suggested it might connect to surface ventilation shafts. This way, he decided, guiding Catalina toward the right passage. It angles upward toward the ridgeline, and if my memory of this district is correct, it should emerge near an old assay office that was abandoned when the silver played out. From there, we can signal Eduardo Morales and arrange for supplies and fresh horses. The plan was optimistic, but it represented their best chance of escaping the immediate pursuit while moving closer to the network of allies who might help them reach Refugio Valley. As they entered the new tunnel, Talon became aware of changes in the air quality that concerned him. The wooden support beams showed signs of rot and insect damage, and loose rocks scattered on the tunnel floor indicated that the ceiling might be unstable. Mining operations had ceased in this section for good reason, and using it as an escape route carried risks that could prove as deadly as the gunmen behind them. But with Morrison's voices growing closer, and the twins beginning to show signs of distress from the cold underground air, they had little choice but to continue forward. The tunnel began to climb more steeply, forcing them to move more slowly. As Catalina struggled with the additional weight of the babies and the physical demands of the ascent so soon after giving birth, Talon could hear her breathing becoming labored, but when he offered to carry one of the twins, she shook her head. Firmly, "A mother does not give up her children," she whispered. "Not to anyone, not for any reason. I will carry them as far as I must." After another 15 minutes of climbing, they reached a section where the tunnel opened into a larger chamber that had once served as a staging area for loading ore carts. Moonlight filtered down through a vertical shaft that connected to the surface, providing their first glimpse of the outside world since escaping the cabin. The light revealed the true condition of their surroundings: water damage, collapsed sections, and wooden supports that looked ready to give way at any moment. More importantly, the moonlight also revealed that they were not alone in the chamber. A figure emerged from the shadows near the loading platform, and Talon's hand moved instinctively toward his knife before he recognized the distinctive silhouette of Eduardo Morales, the traitor he had mentioned to Catalina hours earlier. The Mexican man stepped into the moonlight with his hands visible, showing that he meant no immediate harm, but his presence in the abandoned mine suggested circumstances that were either very fortunate or very dangerous. "Talon Stormhawk," Eduardo said quietly, his accented English carrying undertones of urgency and concern. "I received your signal from the smoke pattern you made this morning, but I expected to meet you at the surface, not in these death traps they call abandoned mines." He gestured toward the unstable ceiling and rotting support beams. "This tunnel will not hold much longer. The winter snows have added too much weight to supports that were marginal when the mine was active." The traitor's appearance raised immediate questions about how he had known to come to this specific location, but Talon recognized that explanations would have to wait until they reached safer ground. "Can you get us out of here?" he asked, helping Catalina sit on a relatively stable pile of ore sacks where she could rest while the twins nursed. "Morrison and at least 2 other gunmen are following us through the main tunnel, and this entire system could collapse if they start shooting or using explosives to force passage." Eduardo nodded grimly. "There is a way, but it requires trust and courage that most people do not possess. The vertical shaft above us connects to an old ventilation system that leads to 3 different surface exits. I have ropes and climbing equipment cached here. But the ascent is dangerous even for experienced miners, and attempting it with newborn babies borders on madness." He studied Catalina with obvious concern. "Are you strong enough for such a climb so soon after childbirth?" Catalina looked up from nursing one of the twins, her eyes flashing with determination that had carried her through ordeals that would have broken most people. "I am strong enough to do whatever is necessary to protect my children," she replied firmly. "If climbing out of hell itself is what it takes to keep Morrison from killing them, then I will climb." Her voice carried absolute conviction, but Talon could see the exhaustion in her face and the slight tremor in her hands that indicated she was operating on willpower alone. The sound of distant explosions echoed through the tunnels, followed by the grinding noise of collapsing timber and falling rock. Morrison had apparently decided that subtlety was less important than speed, and was using dynamite to clear blocked passages or create new routes through the mine system. The blast would destabilize the entire underground complex, making their current location increasingly dangerous with each passing minute. "We go now," Eduardo said, moving to a concealed cache where he had hidden climbing ropes, harnesses, and other equipment needed for ascending the vertical shaft. "The surface exits are all within 2 miles of here, and I have horses waiting at each location. Once we reach daylight, we can move quickly toward the trading post where my people are gathering supplies for your journey to Refugio Valley." His efficiency suggested that this escape route had been planned and prepared long before their current crisis. As Eduardo rigged climbing harnesses and tested rope anchors, Talon helped Catalina prepare the twins for an ascent that would test the limits of what was possible with newborn babies. The carrying sling was redesigned to distribute weight more evenly and provide better protection from potential falls, while additional padding was added to cushion the infants against impacts with rock walls during the climb. Every modification was a compromise between safety and practicality. "There is something you need to know," Eduardo said as he worked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Morrison is not the only one hunting you. Word has reached Blackwood that you escaped with evidence of his crimes, and he has called in favors from federal marshals, territorial rangers, and private detective agencies throughout Colorado and New Mexico. There is a $5,000 bounty on your head, dead or alive, and another $1,000 for each person who helps you." The enormity of the forces arrayed against them was staggering, but it also confirmed what Talon had suspected. Miguel's evidence represented a threat significant enough to justify unprecedented levels of response from Blackwood's criminal organization. "How many people know we are here?" he asked, helping to secure the climbing equipment while keeping one ear tuned to the sounds of pursuit echoing through the tunnels below. "Too many and not enough," Eduardo replied cryptically. "Too many for perfect secrecy, but not enough for the kind of coordinated resistance we need to fight back effectively. That is why your evidence is so important. It provides the proof we need to convince honest federal officials that territorial Corruption extends far beyond a few bad sheriffs and crooked judges. He tested the main climbing rope one final time. But first, we must get you and those babies to safety. The vertical shaft stretched upward into darkness, its walls slick with moisture and loose rock that could dislodge at any moment. Eduardo went first, testing handholds and clearing debris that might fall on the climbers below. Talon followed with Catalina, positioning himself to catch her if exhaustion caused her to lose her grip while she carried the precious burden of her children. The ascent was torturous, measured in inches rather than feet, with frequent stops to allow Catalina to rest and adjust the twins' position. Halfway up the shaft, they could hear Morrison's men entering the chamber below, their voices echoing upward with dangerous clarity. "They came this way," one of them called out, probably examining footprints and other signs of passage. "The rope is still warm. They cannot be far ahead." The sound of boots on rungs indicated that pursuit was beginning immediately, turning their careful climb into a desperate race toward uncertain safety. Eduardo reached the surface first, securing additional ropes and calling down quiet encouragement as Talon helped Catalina navigate the most difficult sections of the ascent. The twins had remained remarkably quiet throughout the climb, but they were beginning to show signs of distress from the cold air and unusual position. Every minute of delay increased the risk that their cries would alert the pursuing gunmen to their exact location. They emerged into a world transformed by moonlight and fresh snow, the surface seeming impossibly bright and open after hours in the claustrophobic tunnels. Eduardo led them quickly away from the shaft, opening toward a grove of aspen trees where 3 horses waited with supplies and equipment needed for the next phase of their journey. The animals were sturdy mountain stock, chosen for endurance rather than speed, with pack saddles that could carry the additional supplies needed for traveling with infants. The trading post is 8 miles northeast, Eduardo explained as he helped secure the twins in a specially modified carrier that would protect them from wind and cold during the ride. "My wife and daughters are preparing food, clean clothing, and medical supplies for the babies. From there, we can arrange for guides who know the mountain trails to Refugio Valley, people who have their own reasons for avoiding territorial law enforcement." But even as they prepared to mount and ride toward temporary safety, the sound of gunshots echoed from the mine shaft behind them. Morrison and his men had discovered the climbing route and were firing upward, hoping to bring down loose rock that might block pursuit or injure the escaping targets. The shots also served as signals, alerting other search parties to their general location and direction of travel. Talon helped Catalina into the saddle, ensuring that the twins were secure and that she had sufficient strength for the ride ahead. Her face was pale with exhaustion and pain, but her eyes burned with the fierce determination of a mother protecting her young. "Can you manage 8 miles?" he asked, checking the straps and buckles that held the precious cargo. She nodded firmly. Though he could see the effort it cost her to project confidence she might not fully feel. As they rode away from the mine complex, following game trails that wound through dense timber toward Eduardo's trading post, Talon found himself thinking about the transformation that had occurred in less than 24 hours. He had begun this journey as a hired tracker pursuing what he believed was a criminal fleeing justice. Now he was a fugitive himself, committed to protecting a woman and her children while fighting against corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The irony was not lost on him that in choosing to protect rather than capture, he had become the very thing he had spent 8 years hunting, a person outside the law, dependent on the help of other outcasts and outlaws for survival. But for the first time since leaving the army, Talon felt that he was on the right side of a conflict, fighting for principles that mattered more than money or reputation, or the simple satisfaction of completing a difficult assignment. Behind them, more gunshots echoed across the mountainside as Morrison's search expanded to include other possible escape routes. The man was thorough and experienced, with resources that seemed unlimited and determination that matched their own. But he was also operating in country where the local population had their own grievances against territorial authority. Among people who had learned that sometimes the law and justice pointed in opposite directions, Eduardo led them through terrain that seemed impossibly rugged, following paths that were invisible to untrained eyes but provided concealment from riders who might be watching the main trails. The trader moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning every canyon, ridge, and hidden valley in this part of Colorado. Knowledge that could mean the difference between freedom and death for people who had chosen to resist, rather than submit to corruption. As dawn approached, and the lights of the trading post became visible through the trees ahead, Talon realized that their real journey was just beginning. They had escaped immediate capture, but the forces arrayed against them were only beginning to mobilize. Blackwood's money could buy loyalty from men throughout the territory, and his political connections could turn local law enforcement into an army dedicated to hunting them down. But they also had advantages that Blackwood could not purchase: the support of people who had suffered under his criminal enterprise, the moral authority that came from fighting for justice rather than profit, and the evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy if it could be delivered to honest federal officials. The next few days would determine whether those advantages were sufficient to overcome superior numbers and resources. Eduardo's trading post emerged from the pre-dawn mist like a fortress carved from the living mountain, its stone walls and heavy timber construction speaking to decades of survival in country where weakness meant death and trust was earned through blood and shared hardship. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, indicating that the complex housed more than just a simple merchant family, and as they approached the main gate, Talon could see armed figures moving in the shadows between buildings, people who had learned to sleep with weapons close at hand and one ear tuned to the sound of approaching trouble. The heavy wooden gates swung open to reveal a courtyard filled with activity that defied the early hour, as if the entire community had been awakened by signals that Talon had not noticed, but Eduardo clearly understood. Women emerged from the main building carrying blankets, hot food, and medical supplies, while men led fresh horses from the stables and checked weapons with the efficient movements of people preparing for war. This was not simply a trading post, it was a fortress, a sanctuary, and a gathering place for people who had chosen resistance over submission. Catalina slumped in her saddle as they entered the courtyard, exhaustion finally overcoming the adrenaline and determination that had carried her through the night's ordeals. The twins had remained remarkably quiet during the 8-mile ride, but they were beginning to show signs of distress that concerned everyone who understood how fragile newborn lives could be in hostile environments. An older Mexican woman with kind eyes and capable hands immediately approached their horse, speaking in rapid Spanish as she assessed Catalina's condition and the needs of the babies. "This is my wife, Maria," Eduardo explained as willing hands helped Catalina dismount and began transferring the twins to a warm, safe environment where they could be properly cared for. "She has delivered more babies than the territorial doctor, and she raised 7 children of her own in country where winter kills the unprepared. Your little ones will be safe with her while we plan the next phase of your journey." The relief in his voice suggested that he understood how close they had all come to disaster during the previous night. Inside the main building, Talon found himself in a world that challenged every assumption he had made about outlaws, fugitives, and people living outside territorial law. The great room was filled with families, children playing quietly while their parents spoke in hushed tones about serious matters, elderly people sharing stories and wisdom earned through lifetimes of struggle, young adults cleaning weapons and studying maps with the focused intensity of soldiers preparing for battle. These were not desperate criminals or violent desperados, but ordinary people who had been pushed beyond the limits of legal patience. A man rose from a table near the fireplace as they entered, his weathered face and graying hair suggesting someone who had earned authority through experience rather than appointment. When he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable accent of educated Mexican society, but his hands bore the calluses of someone accustomed to physical labor, and his eyes held the hard wisdom of a person who had seen too much injustice and chosen to fight rather than accept it. "Senator Stormhawk," he said formally, extending his hand. "I am Don Carlos Mendoza, and I speak for the families gathered here. We have been waiting for someone with evidence strong enough to challenge Blackwood's empire." The introduction revealed layers of organization and planning that Talon had not expected to find among people he had assumed were simply desperate refugees fleeing territorial persecution. Don Carlos was clearly a leader, someone whose education and natural authority had made him a focal point for resistance efforts that extended far beyond simple survival. The maps spread across the table showed detailed information about Blackwood's operations, territorial patrol routes, and safe passage corridors that had been gathered through months or years of careful intelligence work. "How many people are involved in this resistance?" Talon asked, studying the faces around the room and noting the mixture of determination and desperate hope that characterized people who had lost everything, but had not yet lost the will to fight. The question seemed to amuse Don Carlos, who gestured toward the windows that looked out over the trading post compound. "How many stars are in the sky? How many drops of water flow in the Rio Grande? Blackwood has made so many enemies that counting them all would require mathematics beyond my education." But the scope of opposition to Blackwood's criminal enterprise also revealed the magnitude of the challenge they faced in transforming individual grievances into coordinated resistance. Having enemies and having an army are different things, Talon observed, his military experience making him skeptical of optimistic assessments that ignored practical realities. Angry people without organization, weapons, and leadership are just mobs waiting to be slaughtered by professional soldiers who know how to fight. Don Carlos nodded approvingly, as if Talon had passed some kind of test by expressing realistic concerns rather than accepting easy reassurances. "This is why your evidence is so important," he replied, pulling documents from a leather case that had been hidden beneath other papers on the table. "We have been gathering our own proof of Blackwood's crimes, but we lack the legal documentation that could convince federal authorities to intervene. Your brother-in-law's investigation provided the missing pieces we need to present a complete case." The documents Don Carlos spread across the table were stunning in their comprehensiveness and attention to detail. Photographs showed meetings between Blackwood and known criminals. Maps identified properties stolen through forged documents, and sworn statements from witnesses provided testimony about murders, intimidation, and corruption that painted a picture of criminal enterprise operating on an unprecedented scale. Combined with Miguel's evidence, they represented a devastating indictment that could destroy Blackwood's political career and send dozens of territorial officials to federal prison. Among the most damning evidence were detailed financial records that traced bribes paid to federal marshals, territorial judges, and local sheriffs throughout Colorado and New Mexico. The amounts were staggering, tens of thousands of dollars distributed over 3 years to create a network of corruption that extended from mining camps to the territorial capital. Names, dates, and specific transactions were documented with the precision of professional accountants, creating an unshakable foundation for criminal prosecutions that could reach the highest levels of territorial government. Even more disturbing were the photographs that showed federal officials meeting with known outlaws and murderers, apparently coordinating activities that resulted in the elimination of witnesses and the intimidation of honest citizens who might testify against Blackwood's operations. One particularly shocking image showed Judge Marcus Thornfield shaking hands with Jake Morrison outside a Durango hotel, while another captured Federal Marshal Samuel Wickham accepting an envelope from one of Blackwood's known associates in broad daylight on a Denver street. "The problem," Don Carlos continued, "is getting this evidence to honest federal authorities before Blackwood's people can eliminate the witnesses or destroy the documentation. We have tried twice to send representatives to Denver with copies of our proof, but both men disappeared before reaching their destination. Blackwood's network extends far beyond Colorado territory, and his money can buy loyalty from people we never suspected of corruption. The first messenger, according to Don Carlos, had been a former territorial legislator named Roberto Vasquez, who had lost his seat when he refused to vote for railroad subsidies that would have enriched Blackwood at taxpayer expense. Vasquez had volunteered to carry evidence to federal prosecutors in Denver, but his body was found in the Arkansas River 3 days after he departed, apparently the victim of robbery and murder by unknown assailants. The second messenger, a Catholic priest named Father Miguel Santos, had simply vanished without trace while traveling through the San Luis Valley. His horse and belongings discovered abandoned beside a remote mountain trail. Talon studied the maps and documents while his mind worked through the tactical challenges of transporting such volatile evidence across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Traditional approaches had already failed, suggesting that success would require unconventional methods that Blackwood's organization could not predict or easily counter. What about using the resistance network itself as a relay system? He suggested. Instead of sending one person with all the evidence, we send multiple copies along different routes with different groups of people. The suggestion sparked intense discussion among the assembled leaders, with various people offering insights about routes, personnel, and timing that could make such a plan feasible. But it quickly became clear that coordination on such a scale would require communication systems and logistical support that exceeded their current capabilities. More importantly, it would require a level of trust between different resistance groups that had not yet been established across the vast distances involved. A weathered man named Joaquin Herrera, who had been silent during most of the discussion, finally spoke up with information that changed everyone's understanding of their strategic situation. "There is another problem we have not discussed," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years gathering intelligence about territorial law enforcement operations. Blackwood knows about this place. He knows about Don Carlos, about Eduardo, about most of the families gathered here. We have been living on borrowed time, thinking that our remote location and defensive preparations would keep us safe from direct attack. The revelation sent a chill through the assembled leaders as they realized that their sanctuary might actually be a trap waiting to be sprung at Blackwood's convenience. "How long have they known?" Don Carlos asked, his voice remaining steady despite the implications of what Herrera had revealed. "And why have they not acted against us before now?" The questions were tactical, focused on understanding enemy capabilities and intentions rather than expressing despair about compromised security. "At least 6 months, Herrera replied grimly. "One of Blackwood's associates approached my cousin in Pueblo, trying to recruit him as an informant who could provide regular reports about our activities and offensive preparations. My cousin pretended to agree while actually feeding them false information, but the conversation revealed that they have detailed knowledge about our organization, our leadership, and our supply networks. The intelligence painted a picture of calculated patience that was somehow more frightening than immediate aggression would have been. Blackwood had allowed the resistance to grow and organize, gathering evidence and preparing for confrontation, because he was confident that he could eliminate the entire movement whenever he chose to act decisively. The trading post and its surrounding network of safe houses represented not hidden sanctuaries, but known targets that could be destroyed simultaneously when the timing served Blackwood's larger strategic purposes. "Then why are we still alive?" asked Maria Santos, a young woman whose husband had been murdered by federal deputies 6 months earlier while trying to protect his family's ranch from fraudulent seizure. "If they know where we are and have the power to destroy us, why have they allowed us to continue gathering evidence and recruiting new families to our cause?" The question revealed the tactical thinking that had made her a valuable addition to the resistance leadership, despite her youth. Don Carlos studied B. Maps spread across the table, his experienced eyes reading patterns and connections that revealed Blackwood's true strategy. Because they want us to gather in one place where they can eliminate us all at once, he said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. They have been herding us like cattle, allowing us to think we were building strength while actually concentrating. They're enemies in locations where superior firepower could destroy us completely. The realization transformed their understanding of the entire situation, revealing that their careful preparations and growing confidence had been illusions fostered by an enemy who possessed resources and strategic thinking that exceeded their own capabilities. But it also presented an opportunity for those bold enough to recognize and exploit it. If Blackwood expected them to remain in defensive positions, waiting for attack like sheep in a pen, then mobility and aggressive action might catch his forces. Unprepared for resistance that refused to follow anticipated patterns, Talon felt the familiar stirring of combat instincts that had served him well during his years as an army scout, when survival depended on thinking faster and more creatively than enemies who possessed superior numbers and equipment. They expect us to defend this place, he said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had learned to read battlefields and anticipate enemy actions. They have probably positioned forces to surround the trading post and eliminate everyone inside during a coordinated attack. But what if we are not here when they arrive? The suggestion energized the assembled leaders as they began to see possibilities for turning Blackwood's trap into an opportunity for striking back at his organization. If the resistance could evacuate the trading post before the expected attack, leaving behind false evidence of continued occupation, they might be able to ambush the attacking forces and capture or eliminate key personnel who possessed knowledge about the broader criminal conspiracy. Maria Morales appeared in the doorway, carrying one of the twins while beckoning for Catalina to follow her to a private room where mother and babies could rest in comfort and safety. As Catalina rose to leave, she turned back to address the assembled leaders with words that carried the moral authority of someone who had lost everything and found the courage to fight back. My brother died gathering evidence that these men were criminals, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. I will not let his sacrifice be meaningless, because we were too afraid or too disorganized to act on what he discovered. Her words seemed to crystallize something in the room, transforming abstract discussions about tactics and strategy into personal commitments to action. Don Carlos stood and walked to a cabinet where he withdrew an ornate wooden box that clearly held special significance for the community. Inside, wrapped in silk cloth, was a collection of items that represented the losses suffered by families throughout the territory, photographs of murdered relatives, deeds to stolen property, letters from children who had been forced to flee their homes. This is why we fight, Don Carlos said simply, displaying the contents of the box for everyone to see. Not for revenge, not for personal gain, but for justice that will prevent other families from suffering what we have endured. If Senora Vega is willing to risk her life and the lives of her newborn children to see Blackwood face consequences for his crimes, then we must find the courage to support her with everything we possess. The commitment was made without formal votes or elaborate ceremony, but Talon could see it settling over the assembled people like armor put on before battle. These families had been victims for years, forced to hide in mountain sanctuaries while their persecutors prospered through violence and corruption. Now finally, they had evidence that could turn the tables and transform them from hunted refugees into avenging angels of justice. But commitment alone would not overcome the practical challenges they faced in the days ahead. Outside the trading post, Morrison and other professional killers were undoubtedly organizing search parties that would comb every canyon and ridge in the territory. Federal marshals corrupted by Blackwood's money would be watching every major trail and settlement, ready to arrest or eliminate anyone who threatened their benefactors' interests. The resistance had moral authority and local support, but their enemies had superior weapons, unlimited funding, and legal authority that could turn any confrontation into a massacre. Eduardo returned from checking the perimeter defenses, his expression grim as he reported what his scouts had observed during the night. Morrison has at least 12 men now, including 3 federal deputies who arrived from Durango with warrants for your arrest. They are setting up a systematic search pattern that will reach this area within 2 days, and they have telegraph communications with territorial authorities who can bring in additional forces if needed. More disturbing was intelligence about the broader mobilization that Eduardo's network had detected throughout the territory. Federal Marshal Wickham has requested military assistance from Fort Collins, claiming that organized insurrection requires Army intervention to restore territorial authority. If his request is approved, we could be facing cavalry units with artillery support within a week. The prospect of fighting regular Army troops transformed their resistance from a law enforcement problem into a potential military campaign. The intelligence confirmed Talon's worst fears about the resources arrayed against them, but it also provided crucial information about enemy capabilities and intentions that could inform their defensive preparations. Are they planning to attack the trading post directly, or are they hoping to find us before we can reach this sanctuary? The distinction was important because it would determine whether the resistance needed to prepare for a siege or focus on evacuation and mobile defense. Both, Eduardo replied. Morrison knows that we have been gathering evidence and supporting families who oppose Blackwood's operations. Even if you were not here, he would eventually move against us to eliminate a source of opposition that has been troubling his employer for months. Your presence simply provides him with legal justification for actions he was already planning to take. Don Carlos moved to a wall map that showed the surrounding territory in detail, marking locations where resistance families had established safe houses, supply caches, and communication posts. If they want a war, we will give them one, he said, his voice carrying the quiet determination of a man who had been pushed past the point of compromise. But we will fight it on our terms, in country we know better than any federal marshal or hired killer from the cities. The transformation from defensive planning to offensive strategy represented a fundamental shift in the resistance movement's approach to their conflict with Blackwood's organization. For years they had focused on survival and documentation, gathering evidence while avoiding direct confrontation with superior forces. Now, with proof of crimes that could destroy their enemies and the presence of allies who possessed military experience, they were choosing to fight rather than simply endure. Talon found himself at the center of planning discussions that drew on his knowledge of Apache warfare tactics, his experience tracking dangerous men across hostile terrain, and his understanding of how territorial law enforcement operations were organized and conducted. The resistance leaders were intelligent and motivated, but most lacked formal military training that could translate courage and determination into effective combat capability. The key, he explained as they studied maps and discussed potential battle sites, is to force them to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, so they cannot concentrate their superior numbers against any single target. We need to appear stronger than we actually are, more organized than they expect, and more dangerous than they have prepared to face. The Apache way of warfare emphasized deception, mobility, and striking where enemies were weakest while avoiding direct confrontation with superior forces. As the morning progressed and more intelligence arrived from scouts positioned throughout the territory, it became clear that Blackwood's response to their escape had triggered something approaching a general mobilization of territorial law enforcement resources. Federal marshals, territorial rangers, and local sheriffs were coordinating search operations that covered hundreds of square miles, while private detective agencies and professional bounty hunters were converging on Colorado from as far away as Kansas and New Mexico. The magnitude of the response confirmed that Miguel's evidence represented a threat to criminal enterprises far beyond Blackwood's railroad and mining operations. The documentation had apparently exposed connections to political corruption, federal contracting fraud, and interstate criminal conspiracies that involved powerful people throughout the Western Territories. What had begun as a personal quest for justice had evolved into something that could reshape the political landscape of the entire American frontier. But with greater stakes came greater dangers, not just for Talon and Catalina, but for every person who chose to support their cause. The families gathered at Eduardo's trading post were no longer simply hiding from territorial persecution. They were committing acts of armed resistance against federal authority that could result in charges of treason and insurrection. The decision to fight rather than flee carried consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate conflict. In the private room where Catalina rested with her twins, Maria Morales worked with quiet efficiency to ensure that mother and babies had everything needed for the challenges ahead. Clean clothing, proper nutrition, medical supplies, and most importantly, emotional support from women who understood the unique burdens of motherhood in dangerous times. The babies were thriving despite their traumatic birth, showing the resilience that would be essential for survival in the weeks to come. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the trading post compound, final preparations began for a journey that would either end in triumph or disaster. The evidence that could destroy Blackwood's empire was secure. Copies had been made and distributed to trusted messengers who would follow different routes toward federal authorities. And the resistance network was mobilizing for coordinated action throughout the territory. Everything was ready except for the most crucial element: the courage to begin a conflict that would transform victims into warriors and determine whether justice could triumph over corruption in the American West. The dawn attack came exactly as Talon had predicted, but the trading post stood empty except for carefully positioned scarecrows and lanterns, designed to create the illusion of normal activity from a distance. Hidden in the rocky outcroppings 200 yards above the compound, the resistance fighters watched through telescopes as Morrison's enlarged force of 23 men surrounded the buildings with military precision, their confidence evident. In the casual way they approached what they believed would be a simple massacre of helpless families. Catalina lay beside Talon on the cold stone, her twins secured in specially designed carriers that kept them warm while allowing her to remain mobile during the ambush that would determine their fate and the future of justice in Colorado Territory. The babies had remained remarkably quiet during the 3-hour climb to their concealed positions, as if they understood instinctively that their survival depended on absolute silence while their parents prepared to fight the most important battle of their lives. Don Carlos raised his hand in the prearranged signal, and 27 rifles opened fire simultaneously from positions Morrison's men had never suspected existed. The federal deputies and hired killers who had expected to slaughter defenseless families instead found themselves caught in a crossfire that demonstrated what happened when desperate people fought with nothing left to lose. Within minutes, 8 of Morrison's men were dead or wounded, while the survivors scrambled for cover behind buildings that offered inadequate protection from marksmen positioned on the high ground. But Morrison himself proved to be a more dangerous adversary than anyone had anticipated. Instead of retreating in confusion like his surviving men, the former Army scout began organizing a tactical response that revealed professional military training and experience with similar ambush situations. "He is not fighting to win this battle," Talon observed, watching Morrison's tactical decisions through his telescope. "He is fighting to delay us until superior forces can arrive and finish what he started." The assault down the rocky slope required perfect timing and coordination among people who had trained together for only hours rather than months or years. But the righteous fury that drove them compensated for their lack of professional military experience. transforming ordinary families into an effective fighting force united by shared losses and common determination to see justice done. Morrison proved to be exactly the kind of opponent Talon had expected: skilled, experienced, and utterly ruthless in his determination to complete his contract regardless of casualties among his own men or innocent bystanders. But he had made one crucial error in his assessment of his enemies. He had assumed that people fighting for their families would be more cautious than professional soldiers fighting for money, when actually the reverse was true. The battle lasted less than 15 minutes, but those 15 minutes transformed the entire dynamic of the conflict between Blackwood's organization and the resistance movement. When the shooting stopped, Morrison lay wounded but alive, along with 4 of his men who would serve as guides and human shields during the journey toward Fort Collins. The remaining federal deputies and hired killers were dead, eliminating Blackwood's primary enforcement capability in the territory. Under interrogation, Morrison revealed information that transformed their understanding of the scope and complexity of Blackwood's criminal operations. Judge Thornfield was never the real authority behind your contract, Morrison admitted as Don Carlos applied pressure to his wounded shoulder. The orders came from the Department of Interior, from officials who have been selling mineral rights to private companies before the rights were legally available for purchase. You were not hired to capture a runaway bride, you were hired to eliminate the last witness to federal crimes that reach into the highest levels of government. The revelation explained why Blackwood's response to their escape had been so swift and comprehensive, involving resources that seemed disproportionate to the threat posed by a single woman and her evidence of local corruption. If federal officials in Washington were complicit in the conspiracy, then traditional law enforcement channels would be useless for seeking justice. Catalina listened to Morrison's confession while nursing her twins, her face showing the complex mixture of vindication and despair that came with understanding the true magnitude of what they faced. My brother was killed not just by territorial criminals, but by federal officials who saw his investigation as a threat to their own criminal enterprise, she said, her voice carrying steel wrapped in velvet. Justice will require more than presenting evidence to local courts. It will require exposing corruption that reaches into the very heart of American government. Circuit Judge Harrison Webb represented their best hope for honest federal intervention. But reaching him would require traveling through territory controlled by officials who had been compromised by Blackwood's organization. There are over 100 federal marshals, territorial rangers, and army personnel involved in the search for you, Morrison revealed. They have orders to shoot on sight rather than attempt capture, because Washington officials consider the evidence you carry to be a threat to national security. Talon studied the maps Morrison's men carried, noting patrol patterns and defensive positions that revealed both strengths and weaknesses in the federal response. They expect us to run, he said, sharing his tactical assessment with the assembled leadership. Every deployment pattern is designed to contain fleeing fugitives. But if we advance toward their command center, rather than retreating toward the Mexican border, we will be moving through areas they have not adequately defended. The strategic reversal required dividing their forces in ways that maximized their chances of getting critical evidence to Judge Webb while maintaining enough combat capability to protect the families who had committed everything to this fight for justice. Don Carlos would lead most of the resistance fighters toward established safe houses in New Mexico, creating a diversion that would draw federal forces away from Colorado. Talon and Catalina would travel with a small escort toward Fort Collins, using Morrison and his surviving men as guides who could navigate federal security measures from the inside. The plan required trusting their lives to enemies who had been trying to kill them hours earlier. But Morrison's wounds and the death of most of his men had apparently convinced him that cooperation offered better survival prospects than continued resistance. As the resistance forces prepared to separate and begin their divergent journeys toward uncertain destinations, Catalina took time to nurse her twins and prepare them for travel that would test the limits of what newborn babies could endure. The children had remained remarkably healthy despite the dramatic circumstances of their birth and the challenges of their first week of life, showing resilience that seemed to embody the hope that had driven their parents to fight against impossible odds. "Whatever happens in the days ahead," she said to Maria Morales as the older woman helped prepare supplies for the journey, "these children will grow up knowing that their parents chose to fight for justice rather than accept injustice as inevitable. They will understand that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear when the stakes are high enough to justify the risk." The final preparations took place under cloudy skies that promised more snow before nightfall, creating weather conditions that would provide concealment for their movements, while also increasing the dangers of winter travel with infants. Horses were selected for endurance rather than speed, supplies were distributed to balance mobility with survival needs, and weapons were checked one final time by people who understood that the next engagement would likely determine whether their cause succeeded or died with them. As they prepared to mount and begin the most dangerous phase of their journey, Don Carlos approached Talon with words that carried the weight of prophecy spoken by someone who had seen enough history to understand its patterns. "What we do in the next few days will be remembered long after we are dead," he said, clasping the Apache warrior's hand with the firm grip of mutual respect. "We are not just fighting for our own families. We are fighting for the idea that justice can triumph over corruption when ordinary people find extraordinary courage." The small column that departed the trading post shortly before sunset consisted of 7 riders, 2 infants, 4 prisoners, and evidence that could reshape the political landscape of the American West. Behind them, smoke rose from buildings, set ablaze to deny their use to pursuing federal forces, while ahead lay over 100 miles of hostile territory controlled by enemies who had orders to kill them on sight. Talon looked back once at the mountain sanctuary that had sheltered them during the darkest hours of their flight, then turned his face toward the north and the confrontation that would determine whether his transformation from hunter to protector had meaning beyond personal redemption. Beside him, Catalina rode with quiet determination, her twins secure against her chest and her brother's evidence safe in saddlebags that had become the most important cargo in Colorado territory. 3 days later, their small column crested a ridge overlooking Fort Collins, where Circuit Judge Harrison Webb was scheduled to hear cases that could determine the future of justice in the American West. Behind them lay a trail, marked by narrow escapes, desperate battles, and the gradual erosion of Morrison's resistance as he witnessed the evidence of corruption that exceeded even his cynical expectations of government criminality. The courthouse stood like a beacon of hope in the valley below, its federal flag snapping in the cold wind that carried the promise of justice for those brave enough to demand it. But surrounding the building were federal marshals, territorial rangers, and army units that represented the last line of defense for a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American government. As they began their final descent toward the confrontation that would determine whether courage could triumph over corruption, Talon felt the weight of transformation that had carried him from hired killer to protector to something approaching a guardian of justice itself. Beside him, Catalina hummed softly to her twins, the same Spanish lullaby she had sung in the abandoned mine where their incredible journey had begun. The courthouse doors stood open, and beyond them waited a federal judge whose integrity would determine whether their evidence could transform victims into victors and ensure that the children sleeping peacefully in their mother's arms would inherit a world where justice was stronger than greed, where truth was more powerful than corruption, and where ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose courage over comfort.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.